Welcome to Kids Academy.
Hi and welcome to the Kids Academy chess course. My name is Robert Lazorchak and I'm a certified teacher with international and national chess teaching certifications. I will be your guide as we begin to master this great game. Now let's get to the chess. Hi Kids Academy. Today we're going to be learning about the pawn. Now it's true the pawn is the weakest piece in chess, but a famous chess player named Philidor once said that pawns are the soul of chess, so it's very important that we learn as much about them as we can. Now to start with, you have 8 of them, and you can think of pawns as foot soldiers, or in some languages they call the pawn a farmer because he works so hard, he does so much work for the team. Now white has 8 pawns going all across the second rank. You can count them, here are 8 of them. Black has 8 pawns, and they start on the 7th rank. Now the black team always starts on rank 7 and 8, white starts on 1 and 2. And now we're going to learn about the pawn and how it moves. When a pawn is on its starting rank, it has a choice. It can go 1 step, or the pawn can get a running start and go 2 steps forward. The pawn can only go 2 steps if it's still on its starting square. So I'll move my pawn to a4. I will play pawn to e5 for black. This pawn was on its starting square, so he had a choice. He could go to e6 or e5. And now it's white's turn again. This pawn no longer has a choice. He cannot go 2 steps anymore. I know that because he is not on its starting square. This pawn started on a2, and now he's on a4, so he no longer has a choice. Once a pawn has left its starting square, pawns march forward 1 square at a time. So if I wanted to move this pawn, I could put him forward to a5. This pawn can no longer go 2 steps. This pawn can no longer go 2 steps. This pawn can go forward 1 to e4. Now, pawns capture diagonally. So they capture differently than they move. Pawns move forward. They never go sideways. They never go backwards. It's the only piece in chess. So after white plays pawn to a5 and black plays pawn to e4, if white plays the move pawn to e3, now this black pawn actually is out of moves. He can no longer go forward because there's someone in the way, and pawns do not attack forward, pawns attack diagonally. So this pawn, we say it's stuck, it's frozen, it has no moves to make. There's someone blocking his path forward, and pawns attack diagonally, and I'll show you what that means right now. If black plays the move pawn b6, this pawn can capture the black pawn. This pawn can capture on b6 because pawns capture diagonally forward 1 step. Now it's black's turn. Can black recapture on b6? The answer is yes. Both the pawn on c7 or the pawn on a7 can capture that pawn. The black pawns are starting on the 7th rank. They're marching down the board, so this would be a forward capture for the c7 and a7 pawn. The pawn can capture. Okay, white plays the move pawn b4. Black plays the move pawn b5. Can this white pawn capture the black pawn on b5? The answer is no. The white pawn does not capture. Pawns do not capture moving forward, so this black pawn is safe. Can this white pawn move at all? The answer is no. Pawns never go sideways. Pawns never go backwards. They do not capture moving forwards. There's nothing for the pawn to capture diagonally, so this pawn is stuck. He has no moves to make. White would have to think of something else to move. Pawn a3. Okay, time for some questions. Can this pawn on a7 go to a5? The answer is yes. The pawn can go 2 steps and go to a5. Remember, a pawn on its starting square and the black pawns start on the 7th rank. A pawn on its starting square has an option, 1 step or 2. After that, pawns go 1 at a time. Okay, let's pretend we have a position where this black pawn is on h4. Now, one thing I did not mention yet is that if you have a pawn on its starting square, it cannot go forward 1 and do a capture. I know I said a pawn on its starting square can go 2 spaces on its first move, but the pawn can only go 2 spaces in the forward direction. We cannot combine a forward square and a capture. So this pawn can go forward 2, or he could have gone forward 1, but this pawn is not allowed to go forward 1 and then do a capture in the same turn. Put the black pawn back. Okay, so let's play pawn g4 for white. Let's play pawn f5 for black. White's turn. Does white have any captures in this position? And once you answer that question, are there any white pawns that can no longer move right now that are stuck? So to answer those questions, we have a capture here. Our pawn on g4 is attacking the black pawn on f5. White could capture. Conversely, the black pawn is attacking the white pawn. So if it were black's turn, the black pawn could do a capture. And the question about pawns being stuck, let's see. Well, this pawn on h3 has nothing to capture, and he can't go forward. There's a black pawn standing in his way. And also, even if it weren't a black pawn, if it were a bishop, this pawn would still be stuck. As long as there's something in the way that prevents the pawn from moving forward, because there could only be one piece or pawn on a square at a time, then this pawn has no moves to make. Can't go forward, can't do a capture. Also, the pawn on b4 and black's pawn on b5 are both also stuck. They have no moves to make right now. The last thing I want to tell you about pawns before we stop this video, it's very rarely a good idea to send one pawn off by itself, because when it gets close to the other end of the board, it'll either get stuck or captured. Pawns love to work together as a team to make what's called a pawn chain. Notice how this white pawn on f2 protects the pawn on g3, which in turn protects the pawn on h4. So that means if any black pieces were to capture this pawn on h4, white would be able to capture back. g3 is guarding h4, so at the very least it would be a fair trade. Maybe white could even win some material. So use your pawns together as a team as they slowly march across the board and take up more and more space. Let's review what we learned about pawns. Pawns never go sideways, they never go backwards. When a pawn is on its starting square on the 2nd rank for white or the 7th rank for black, when a pawn is on its starting square, it has a choice. It can go forward 1 step or 2, but once the pawn has left its starting square, pawns move forward 1 step at a time. Pawns capture in a different way than they move. So pawns move forward, but they capture diagonally 1 step at a time. They never capture diagonally 2 steps, even if they're on their starting square. Pawns can capture diagonally 1 step at a time. If there's a pawn in front of our pawn, or if there's a piece in front of our pawn, and we have no captures to make, then we say that pawn is stuck. It cannot move. It has no options. We would have to think of something else and move that piece instead. So that is it for the pawns. Probably the trickiest piece, and I want you to really get some practice playing pawns. My recommendation would be to play a pawn war, 8 pawns against 8 pawns, and you can play with someone at home or a friend, and the winner of this pawn war would be the first player to get a pawn to the other side of the board. So remember, use your pawns as a team, create pawn chains, march them across the board together so they can support one another, and try to get a pawn to the other end. That'll help us practice pawn movements, pawn captures. Pawns have a lot of special rules that don't apply to other pieces, and it'll give us a lot of practice with this very important, albeit weaker, piece. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new videos. Find links to our apps in the comments below.